I never thought my own son would look me in the eye and tell me I needed to move to a shelter. I was folding his father's old navy shirts in the spare bedroom when Micah walked in with papers in his hand and guilt written across his face. 69 years old, 6 months after my stroke, and I was finally getting my strength back. Tasha was 3 months pregnant, he said, and they needed space. The baby needed a nursery. I needed professional care. All reasonable explanations that felt like lies in my gut. But what do you say when your only child tells you there's no room for you anymore? How do you prepare for the possibility that everything you believed about family might be wrong? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Hailey Brew, and I've been telling myself stories my whole life. Stories about love lasting forever, about children honoring their parents, about family being the one thing you could count on when everything else fell apart, maybe? That's why it took me so long to see the truth sitting right in front of me at my own kitchen table. The house where this all unfolded sits on Bull Street in Savannah's historic district, a 3-story Victorian that Charles and I bought in 1978, when Micah was just 10 years old. We'd saved every penny for the down payment, me working double shifts at the textile mill, while Charles took on week and construction jobs after his Navy discharge. The house needed everything: new plumbing, electrical work, a roof that didn't leak when the Georgia storms rolled in from the coast. But Charles saw the bones of something beautiful, and I saw a place where our son could grow up with space to run and neighbors who remembered your name. Charles had been gone for 21 years now, taken by a heart attack at 48, while he was replacing rotted boards on the front porch. One minute he was humming an old Motown song, the next he was lying still in the azalea bushes, his hammer still gripped in his hand. The doctor said it was massive and instant, that he wouldn't have felt pain. I held on to that comfort through the fog of grief that followed, through raising Micah alone, through the long nights when the house felt too big and too quiet. After Charles died, I threw myself into my seamstress work, taking in alterations and custom pieces from the ladies in the historic district who appreciated hand-stitched hems and invisible mending. My sewing room occupied what used to be Charles's workshop in the basement, surrounded by his tools that I couldn't bear to pack away, and bolts of fabric that arrived weekly from suppliers in Atlanta. The work kept my hands busy and my mind occupied, and the steady income meant I could keep the house and put money aside for Micah's college. Micah grew up to be a good boy, though perhaps too eager to please and too quick to bend under pressure. He studied business at Georgia Southern, married Tasha Williams 2 years after graduation, and started his own real estate company specializing in historic properties. He had Charles's kind eyes and my stubborn streak, though somewhere along the way he'd learned to smooth over his stubbornness with a quick smile and accommodating words. Tasha was beautiful in the way that required constant maintenance weekly. Salon appointments, monthly facials, clothes that are whispered expensive even when they weren't. She'd grown up in Charleston society, the kind of family that traced their lineage back to the founding fathers and never let you forget it. When she married Micah, I could see she was marrying into potential rather than reality, betting on his ambition to lift them both into the social circles she felt she deserved. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in late August, while I was threading my machine for a wedding dress alteration. One moment I was examining the delicate beadwork on ivory silk, the next I was waking up in Savannah General with Micah holding my hand and Dr. Alana Ruiz explaining that I'd had a minor cerebrovascular accident. The left side of my face drooped slightly, my left hand trembled when I tried to grip things, and my balance felt unsteady. But my mind remained sharp as ever, cataloguing every worried expression that crossed my son's face. "You can't go home alone, Mama," Micah said during my second day in the hospital. "Not until we know you're steady on your feet again." Tasha stood beside him, nodding with what looked like genuine concern. "We insist, Hailey, the guest room is all ready for you. I've already moved my exercise equipment out, so I moved in with my son and daughter-in-law, bringing 2 suitcases of clothes, my jewelry box, and Charles's navy ring that I wore on a chain around my neck. The ring was white gold with a small anchor engraved on the band, accompanied by the inscription "Forever yours, C.B." Charles had worn it through to deployments in Vietnam and 23 years of marriage. After he died, wearing it close to my heart felt like keeping a piece of him with me. The first month of living with Micah and Tasha went smoothly enough. I kept to myself mostly, reading in the guest room or helping with light cooking when my coordination allowed. Tasha was solicitous in a way that felt slightly performed, asking about my therapy exercises and bringing me herbal tea that tasted like flowers and disappointment. Micah checked on me every morning before work and every evening when he returned, updating me on his latest property deals and asking detailed questions about my physical therapy progress. By October, my strength was returning faster than anyone expected. The facial drooping had almost completely resolved. My hand steadiness improved daily, and I could walk the length of the house without feeling dizzy. Dr. Ruiz was pleased with my progress during follow-up appointments, noting that my cognitive function had never been impaired and my physical recovery was exceeding typical timelines for someone my age. "You're doing remarkably well, highly," she said during my 12-week checkup. "I'd say you're ready to resume normal activities. How are you feeling about returning to your own home?" I told her I was eager to get back to my sewing room and my familiar routines. What I didn't mention was how I'd begun to feel like an intruder in my son's house, sensing conversations that stopped when I entered rooms and noticing the way Tasha's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. That evening, I mentioned Dr. Ruiz's assessment to Micah and Tasha over dinner. We were eating takeout Chinese food from cartons on the coffee table, a casual Tuesday night tradition that had developed during my stay. "That's wonderful news, Mama," Micah said, though his enthusiasm felt forced. Dr. Ruiz has always been thorough. Tasha picked at her lo mein with delicate precision. Of course, rushing back to living alone might not be the wisest choice. What if you have another episode? What if you fall down those steep stairs to your sewing room? "I've been going up and downstairs for months now," I pointed out. "And I haven't had any dizzy spells in weeks." Still, Tasha continued, "At your age, it might be time to consider more supportive living arrangements. Somewhere with medical staff on hand, activities designed for seniors, a community of people in similar situations." I set down my chopsticks and looked at her carefully. "Are you suggesting I move to a nursing home?" "Not a nursing home," Micah said quickly, "more like an independent living community. Somewhere with assistance available if you need it, but freedom to come and go as you please." The conversation ended there, but it planted a seed of unease that grew over the following weeks. I began paying closer attention to the small interactions between Micah and Tasha, the whispered conversations that ceased when I appeared, the way Tasha's phone calls often moved to another room when I was present. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early November, Tasha made her announcement. She was pregnant. The news came during breakfast, delivered with a radiant smile and tears of joy that sparkled in the morning light streaming through the dining room windows. Micah swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and protested that he was making her dizzy. I watched this scene of domestic bliss and felt something cold settle in my stomach. "When are you due?" I asked. "June," Tasha said, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat abdomen. "We just found out yesterday. We wanted to wait until we were sure before telling anyone." I calculated quickly in my head. If she just found out and was due in June, she was approximately 3 months along, but I'd been living in their house for nearly that entire time, and I hadn't noticed any of the typical signs: no morning sickness, no changes in eating habits, no sudden aversions to smells or foods. Tasha had been drinking wine with dinner as recently as the previous weekend, but pregnancies were different for every woman, I reminded myself. Some were lucky enough to avoid the unpleasant symptoms entirely, and Tasha had always been careful about her appearance and behavior, skilled at maintaining a composed exterior regardless of what she might be feeling internally. "That's wonderful news," I said, meaning it despite my growing unease. "Charles and I always hoped Micah would give us grandchildren someday." Over the following days, I watched Tasha more carefully, looking for the subtle signs of early pregnancy I remembered from my own experience carrying Micah. But if anything, she seemed more energetic than usual, taking longer runs through the neighborhood and maintaining her usual social schedule of lunch dates and shopping trips with friends. It was during this period of observation that I began to notice other things that had nothing to do with pregnancy, but everything to do with the carefully constructed narrative of my welcome in their home. The papers appeared on the kitchen counter on a grey November morning. Official letterhead from Magnolia Gardens Senior Living Community catching the overhead light like a beacon of betrayal. I was making coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, a habit from my mill working days that 69 years hadn't managed to break, when I noticed the manila folder beside the fruit bowl, Magnolia Gardens. I knew the place, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of Savannah where families sent their elderly relatives when maintaining appearances became more important than maintaining relationships. The brochures always featured smiling seniors engaged in pottery classes and garden parties, but everyone in town knew it was where you went when your children had decided you'd lived long enough in their world. My hands trembled as I opened the folder, and for a moment I wondered if my stroke symptoms were returning. But this trembling came from somewhere deeper than damaged blood vessels. This shook the very foundation of everything I'd believed about my place in my son's life. The admission forms were partially completed, Micah's careful handwriting filling in my personal information with the mechanical precision he brought to real estate contracts. Name, Hailey Marie Brew. Date of birth, March 15th, 1956. Emergency contact, Micah Brew, son. Medical history, recent CVA with residual weakness. But it was the section marked reason for admission that made my coffee cup slip from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen tile with a sound that seemed loud enough to wake the entire house. Patient requires supervised living environment due to ongoing health concerns and family's inability to provide adequate care during upcoming major life transition. Family's inability to provide adequate care. The words burned like acid in my throat. I was still staring at the papers when Micah appeared in the kitchen doorway, his hair rumpled from sleep, and his expression shifting from concern to guilt the moment he saw what I was holding. "Mama, I can explain it, can you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Because I'm having trouble understanding how my recovery suddenly became an inability to provide adequate care." Tasha materialized beside him, one hand protectively placed over her abdomen in a gesture that was becoming as familiar as it was suspicious. She wore a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. "Hailey, we know this is difficult," she said, her voice soft with manufactured sympathy. "But with the baby coming, we need to think about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone," I repeated slowly. "And you determined that what's best for everyone is shipping me off to a facility without even discussing it with me first." "We've been discussing it," Micah said, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized from his childhood, when he'd been caught in lies about homework or broken windows. "We just wanted to have options ready before we talk to you about it." "Options." I set the papers down carefully on the counter, taking care not to let my emotions show in my movements. "What other options were you considering?" The silence that followed was answer enough. There were no other options. There had been no discussion. There had been a decision made about my life without my input, my consent, or apparently any consideration. For my feelings on the matter, "The baby's nursery needs to be set up," Tasha said, filling the silence with words that felt rehearsed. "And with my condition, I need a calm, quiet environment. The doctor says stress can be dangerous in the first trimester." "Your condition," I said, looking at her closely. "You're feeling unwell." "Nothing serious," she said quickly. "Just the usual pregnancy symptoms, fatigue, nausea, sensitivity to noise, and disruptions." But as she spoke, I noticed she was wearing makeup full coverage foundation, carefully applied, mascara, lipstick that suggested she'd been awake long enough to complete an entire beauty routine. In my experience, women suffering from pregnancy nausea rarely had the energy or inclination for such elaborate preparations at 6:30 in the morning. "When is your next doctor's appointment?" I asked. Tasha's hand moved to her throat, a nervous gesture I'd noticed she made when asked direct questions. "Next Tuesday, Dr. Patterson wants to monitor everything closely." Double quotes Dr. Patterson. I filed that name away carefully. along with the growing list of details that didn't quite align with my understanding of early pregnancy. "Mama," Micah said, stepping closer with his hands extended as if approaching a spooked animal. "Magnolia Gardens is a nice place. They have activities, medical staff, people your own age. You might actually enjoy it more than staying here where you don't have much company during the day." "I have my sewing," I said. "I have my books. I have 30 years of memories in my own home that I'd like to get back to." "Your sewing room is in the basement," Tasha pointed out. "Those stairs are steep and dangerous for someone with balance issues." "I don't have balance issues anymore. Dr. Ruiz cleared me for normal activities." "Dr. Ruiz doesn't live with you," Tasha said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "She doesn't see you when you get dizzy after climbing stairs or when you drop things because your hand coordination isn't quite right." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't see, because the truth was, I hadn't been dizzy after climbing stairs. I hadn't been dropping things. My coordination had been steadily improving, my strength returning, my confidence growing. "But how do you argue with people who claim to be witnessing symptoms you know you're not experiencing?" "I think," I said carefully, "that before any decisions are made about my living situation, I should have another appointment with Dr. Ruiz, get a comprehensive evaluation, make sure we're all working with accurate information about my current condition." Micah and Tasha exchanged a look that lasted just a fraction too long, a silent communication that excluded me entirely. "Of course," Micah said. "That's a good idea, but in the meantime, maybe you could just visit Magnolia Gardens. See what they have to offer. It's not a commitment, just information gathering." The reasonable tone, the logical progression, the careful way he was maneuvering me toward compliance, it all felt like watching a real estate deal unfold, complete with strategic presentations and predetermined outcomes. "Fine," I said. "I'll visit, but I want to schedule my own appointment with Dr. Ruiz first." "Already done," Tasha said brightly. "I called yesterday and set something up for Friday. I thought you might want a thorough checkup before making any major decisions." The efficiency of it bothered me almost as much as the presumption. How long had they been planning this? How many conversations had happened around me, about me, without me? How many decisions had been made before I'd even seen those papers? On the counter, after Micah left for work and Tasha retreated to her room for what she called pregnancy rest, I sat alone in the kitchen with the admission forms spread in front of me like evidence of a crime I was still trying to understand. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the papers that seemed to underscore every doubt and suspicion I'd been nurturing. I thought about Charles, about the conversations we used to have about aging and family, and what we hoped our final years would look like. He'd made me promise, during one of our late-night talks after his mother had been moved to a facility against her wishes, that I would never let anyone make me disappear quietly. "Promise me, Hailey," he'd said, holding my hand in the darkness of our bedroom. "Promise me that if anyone ever tries to put you away, somewhere you don't want to be, you'll fight. You'll make noise. You won't let them erase you just because it's convenient." I'd promised, thinking at the time that such a scenario was impossible. Micah loved me. Micah would protect me. Micah would never let anyone treat his mother as a burden, to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. But sitting in that kitchen, holding papers that reduced my entire life to a series of checkboxes and medical codes, I began to understand that love and protection weren't always the same thing. And sometimes the people who claimed to love you most were the ones most capable of convincing themselves that betrayal was actually kindness. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. I answered without checking the caller ID, still distracted by the weight of realization. "Hailey, it's Aelana Ruiz. I have you down for an appointment Friday morning, but I wanted to call and check if everything's all right. Your daughter-in-law mentioned some concerns about your recovery progress." Dr. Ruiz's voice was professionally neutral, but I caught something underneath a note of confusion, perhaps even suspicion. "I'm fine," I said. "Better than fine, actually, but I do have some questions I'd like to discuss with you." "Of course." "I'll see you Friday at 10, and Hailey. If you're having any problems at all, please don't hesitate to call me directly. After she hung up, I sat holding the phone and wondering what exactly Tasha had told her. What concerns had been mentioned, what picture of my condition had been painted without my knowledge or input. The admission papers stared up at me from the counter, waiting for my signature to make their betrayal complete. But I wasn't ready to sign anything, not yet. Not until I understood exactly what game was being played and who was playing it, because somewhere between the papers and the phone call and the growing list of inconsistencies, I'd begun to suspect that this wasn't really about my health at all. This was about something else entirely. Something that had everything to do with inheritance and nothing to do with care. And if I was right, then my son and his wife had made a serious mistake. They'd underestimated exactly how sharp this old woman's mind still was. Friday morning arrived wrapped in the kind of fog that makes Savannah look like a city caught between worlds, where the past and present blur together until you can't tell which shadows belong to memory and which to reality. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Dr. Ruiz, choosing clothes that reflected competence rather than frailty, a navy blue dress with pearl buttons that Charles had always admired, low heels that demonstrated my steady balance, and my hair arranged in the careful style I'd maintained since my teenage years working at the textile mill. Micah offered to drive me, a gesture of solicitude that felt more like supervision. I declined politely, explaining that I wanted to demonstrate my independence to Dr. Ruiz by managing the appointment entirely on my own. The truth was more complicated. I needed time to think, without the weight of his expectations or Tasha's carefully orchestrated concern filling the car. The drive through Savannah's historic district felt like traveling through my own life story. I passed the textile mill, where I'd worked double shifts to help pay for our house, now converted into luxury condominiums that priced out the working families who'd built the neighborhood. I drove by the elementary school where Micah had played, Little League Baseball, where Charles had coached, and I'd managed the team snack schedule with military precision. Every familiar landmark reminded me of the woman I'd been before stroke, and uncertainty had clouded my sense of self. Dr. Ruiz's office occupied the ground floor of a renovated Victorian mansion on Bull Street, just 8 blocks from my own home. Ailana had been our family physician for over 20 years, treating everything from Micah's childhood ear infections to Charles's high blood pressure to my own journey through menopause and beyond. She'd held my hand during Charles's funeral and celebrated with me when Micah graduated college. If anyone would give me honest answers about my condition, it would be Ailana. The waiting room was nearly empty at 10 on a Friday morning. Just myself and an elderly gentleman reading a magazine with shaking hands that reminded me of my own post-stroke tremors. I checked in with the receptionist, noting the way she smiled with genuine warmth rather than professional obligation. Dr. Ruiz will see you shortly. Mrs. Brew, she mentioned you might need extra time today. Extra time? That suggested Ailana was expecting more than a routine follow-up visit. That suggested someone had prepared her for complications or concerns that required careful discussion. When Ailana called my name 15 minutes later, I followed her down the familiar hallway lined with photographs of Savannah's historic homes. Her office hadn't changed much over the years, the same oak desk, where she'd delivered news both good and devastating, the same bookshelf filled with medical texts and family photos, the same window overlooking the garden where Charles had proposed. 31 years ago, highly, she said, settling into her chair with the easy familiarity of our long friendship. How are you feeling, really feeling? Not how everyone else thinks you should be feeling. The distinction was deliberate, and I appreciated her directness. Ailana had always been skilled at reading between the lines of family dynamics, understanding that patients sometimes needed permission to speak honestly about situations they couldn't control. I feel stronger than I have since the stroke, I said. My balance is good, my coordination is improving daily, and my mind feels as sharp as ever. Maybe sharper, actually, because I'm paying attention to things I might have missed before. Ailana made notes on my chart, her pen moving with the quick precision I remember from decades of appointments. That's consistent with your progress. Over the past several months, your recovery has been remarkably good for someone your age. Then why, I asked, did my daughter-in-law call you with concerns about my condition? Eleanor's pen paused, and she looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. What did she tell you about our conversation? She didn't tell me anything about a conversation. She mentioned making an appointment and said you'd want to monitor everything closely. But yesterday you called and mentioned concerns she'd raised, setting down her pen. Aelana leaned back in her chair with the deliberate movement of someone choosing her words carefully. Tasha called on Wednesday. She said you'd been having increased dizzy spells, episodes of confusion, and problems with coordination that suggested your recovery might be plateauing or even regressing. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they described my condition, but because they so completely contradicted my actual experience. I haven't had a dizzy spell in over a month, I said. I haven't been confused about anything except why my family seems so eager to move me out of their house. And my coordination is fine. I've been helping with cooking and light cleaning without any problems. Aelana picked up my chart and flipped through several pages, her frown deepening as she read. That's interesting, because Tasha was quite specific about these symptoms. She mentioned that you'd dropped dishes, gotten lost coming back from short walks, and had several near falls on the stairs. None of that is true. My voice was steady, but my hands were starting to shake with anger rather than medical symptoms. None of it. I didn't think it sounded right, Aelana admitted. Your cognitive function was never impaired, and your physical recovery has been consistently positive. But when family members report concerning changes, I have to take them seriously. What exactly did she ask you to do? Aelana hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. She wanted me to document these symptoms and provide a medical opinion about your capacity for independent living. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Tasha wasn't just pushing for me to move to Magnolia Garden. She was building a medical case to support the necessity of that move. She was creating a paper trail that would justify her decision and absolve Micah of any guilt about abandoning his mother. Aelana, I said, leaning forward in my chair. I need you to document exactly what you observed during this appointment. My actual condition, not what someone else claims they've witnessed. Of course, Eleanor's voice carried the weight of understanding. That extended beyond medical protocol. Let's do a comprehensive evaluation. For the next 45 minutes, Aelana put me through every test she could think of: balance assessments, coordination exercises, cognitive evaluations, blood pressure monitoring, reflexes, memory challenges. She asked me to walk across her office, to stand on one foot, to recite the months of the year backwards, to remember and repeat lists of words and numbers. When we finished, she made extensive notes while I watched, documenting everything with the kind of thoroughness that suggested she understood the importance of accurate records. Highly, she said finally, you're in excellent health for someone your age, with or without the stroke history. Your balance is good, your cognitive function is sharp, and your coordination is well within normal ranges. I see no medical reason why you couldn't live independently. Could you put that in writing? I'm putting it in your medical record right now. And I'm also documenting the discrepancy between reported symptoms and observed condition. Aelana looked up from her notes with concern creasing her features. Are you safe at home, Hailey? Is someone pressuring you about living arrangements? The question opened a door I'd been afraid to walk through, even in my own mind. Was I safe? Were Micah and Tasha pressuring me, or were they genuinely concerned about my welfare? How do you tell the difference between manipulation and care when the people involved are your own family? I don't know, I answered honestly. But I'm beginning to think I need to find out. Aelana handed me a business card with her direct phone number written on the back. Call me if you need anything. And Hailey, trust your instincts. You've always been one of the smartest women I know. Driving home, I felt both vindicated and deeply troubled. Eleanor's evaluation had confirmed what I'd known about my own condition, but it had also revealed the extent of Tasha's deception. Whether Micah knew his wife was fabricating symptoms or whether he'd been manipulated along with everyone else remained unclear. What was clear was that someone was working very hard to create a narrative that painted me as incapable and burdensome. Someone needed me out of the way badly enough to lie to my doctor and manipulate my son into believing I was more disabled than I actually was. As I pulled into the driveway of Micah's house thinking of it that way now instead of as my temporary home, I saw Tasha through the front window, pacing back and forth while talking animatedly on her phone. When she noticed my car, she quickly ended the call and disappeared from view. By the time I reached the front door, she was waiting with a bright smile and what appeared to be genuine concern. "How did your appointment go?" she asked. "Did Dr. Ruiz find anything concerning?" "Actually," I said, watching her face carefully. She was surprised by how well I'm doing. She said my recovery has exceeded expectations and that I'm in excellent shape for independent living. For just a moment, something flickered across Tasha's expression, disappointment, perhaps, or frustration. But it was gone so quickly, I might have imagined it. "That's wonderful news," she said. Though I'm sure she emphasized the importance of being cautious. Recovery can be unpredictable, especially at your age. She didn't mention anything about being cautious. In fact, she encouraged me to resume normal activities. Tasha's smile faltered slightly. "Well, doctors don't always see what family members see on a daily basis. They only observe you for a few minutes in their office." "That's true," I agreed. "Family members do see things differently." But as I said it, I was thinking about how differently Tasha and I seemed to be seeing my condition. And I was wondering exactly what she was hoping to accomplish by convincing everyone, including possibly herself, that I was more impaired than I actually was. That evening at dinner, I shared Dr. Ruiz's positive assessment with Micah. He seemed pleased but distracted, his attention frequently drawn to his phone and to whispered conversations with Tasha that took place in the kitchen while I set the table. "Maybe," I suggested over dessert, "this would be a good time to discuss my moving back to my own house." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. "Let's not rush into anything," Micah said finally, "even if you're doing well. Now, a lot could change quickly. And with the baby coming, it might be better to wait until after Tasha delivers before making any major decisions." "The baby isn't due until June," I pointed out. "That's 7 months away." "Pregnancies can be unpredictable," Tasha said, her hand moving to her abdomen in that protective gesture I'd begun to notice she made whenever anyone questioned her timeline or condition. "The doctor wants me to avoid stress and disruption during the first trimester. How far along are you now?" I asked. 14 weeks, she said without hesitation. But something about the quick response bothered me. In my experience, women in early pregnancy usually knew their exact week count because they were counting down to milestones: the end of the first trimester, the anatomy scan, the point when they could feel movement. Tasha's answer felt rehearsed, rather than lived. That night, lying in the guest bed, surrounded by my temporary belongings, I thought about Charles and the conversations we'd had about growing old together. We'd planned to travel, to spend time with grandchildren, to enjoy the house we'd worked so hard to make our own. Charles had died before any of those dreams came true, but I'd held on to them anyway, imagining how I might create meaning and purpose in my later years. None of those imagined futures had included being managed and manipulated by my own family. None of them had prepared me for the possibility that love and control might become indistinguishable in the eyes of people who claimed to care about me. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around me, I began to formulate a different kind of plan. If someone was building a case against my independence, then I needed to build a case for it. If someone was creating false narratives about my condition, then I needed to document the truth. And if my own family couldn't be trusted to protect my interests, then I needed to find other people who would. The pregnancy journal appeared on the coffee table 3 days after my appointment with Dr. Ruiz, positioned precisely where I couldn't help but notice it during my morning routine. My journey to motherhood was embossed in gold script across the pale pink cover, and it lay open to a page filled with Tasha's careful handwriting documenting symptoms, cravings, and emotional milestones that painted a picture of textbook pregnancy progression. I shouldn't have read it. I knew that even as I picked it up, even as I settled into the wingback chair where I'd spent so many mornings reading while Micah and Tasha prepared for their days. But something about the journal's convenient placement felt intentional, as If Tasha wanted me to see this evidence of her condition. Week 14. Morning sickness finally subsiding, though certain smells still trigger nausea. Doctor says everything looks perfect. Baby's heartbeat strong at 150 bpm. Micah cried when he heard it for the first time. Can't wait to meet our little miracle. The entry was dated yesterday, written in the same careful penmanship I'd seen on thank you notes and grocery lists throughout my stay. But something about the tone bothered me to polish, to complete, like a performance of pregnancy, rather than the messy reality I remembered from carrying Micah. I flipped backwards through the pages, reading entries that documented her journey, from the first missed period through the early weeks of symptoms and medical appointments. Each entry was detailed and emotionally rich, filled with the kind of intimate observations that pregnant women typically shared only with their closest friends or family members. Week 8. Threw up 3 times this morning. Micah bought ginger tea and crackers, feeling so grateful for his support. Worried about telling Hailey timing feels complicated with her recovery. Week 10. First prenatal appointment with Dr. Patterson, everything measuring perfectly on schedule. Saw the tiny bean on ultrasound and fell in love instantly. Micah keeps staring at the picture. Week 12. Energy starting to return. Nausea mostly gone except for mornings. Doctor says I can resume light exercise. Hailey seems to be doing much better, but I worrying about her living alone when the baby comes. The entries painted a picture of a devoted wife and daughter-in-law, someone genuinely concerned about my welfare while navigating the challenges of first-time pregnancy. But reading them all together, I was struck by how conveniently they supported the narrative that had been developing around my living situation. What troubled me most was how polished they seemed. When I'd kept a pregnancy journal with Micah, my entries had been erratic and emotional, sometimes just a few words scribbled between doctor's appointments, other times pages of anxious rambling about labor fears and nursery preparations. These entries read like someone was consciously documenting a pregnancy for an audience rather than processing the experience for herself. Finding some light reading. Tasha's voice startled me, and I looked up to see her standing in the doorway, with a coffee cup and an amused expression. I'm sorry, I said, closing the journal and setting it back on the table. I shouldn't have. It's fine, she interrupted, settling onto the couch with graceful movements that seemed inconsistent with someone supposedly dealing with pregnancy fatigue. I left it out because I thought you might be interested. It's such an exciting time for all of us. It must be wonderful to document everything so thoroughly, I said. I wish I'd been that organized when I was pregnant with Micah. I'm a planner by nature, Tasha said, smoothing her silk robe over her still flat abdomen. I want to remember every detail of this experience. Have you thought about names yet? We're waiting to find out the gender first. The anatomy scan is scheduled for next month. Tasha took a delicate sip of her coffee, and I noticed she wasn't avoiding caffeine the way most pregnant women did in their first trimester. Are you drinking regular coffee? I asked. Tasha glanced down at her cup as if surprised by the question. Oh, this is decaf. Dr. Patterson said 1 cup of regular coffee a day would be fine. But I'm being extra cautious. Another small detail that didn't quite align with my understanding of early pregnancy caution. Most expectant mothers I'd known had been militant about avoiding caffeine, alcohol, and anything else that might pose even minimal risk to their developing babies. When is your next appointment? I asked. Thursday, she said without hesitation. Dr. Patterson likes to see patients every 2 weeks during the first trimester. I filed away this information along with a growing collection of details that felt somehow off kilter. Every answer Tasha provided was reasonable and medically sound, but taken together, they painted a picture that felt more theoretical than experiential. That afternoon, while Tasha was out shopping and Micah was showing properties, I did something I'd never done before in my 69 years. I deliberately snooped through someone else's private belongings. The decision didn't come easily, but my growing suspicions had reached a point where passive observation felt inadequate. I started with the guest bathroom that Tasha and Micah shared, looking for the telltale signs of pregnancy that most women accumulated during their first trimester. I found prenatal vitamins in the medicine cabinet, their bottle nearly full despite Tasha's claim to be 14 weeks along. I found a pregnancy test still in its box. unopened, which struck me as odd for someone who'd already confirmed her condition with a doctor. What I didn't find were the practical accommodations most pregnant women made: no extra toothbrushes for morning sickness episodes, no crackers or ginger products for nausea management, no changes to personal care products to avoid ingredients that might be harmful during pregnancy. Moving to their bedroom felt like a violation, but I was committed to understanding what was really happening in my son's house. Tasha's side of the closet revealed clothes in all the same sizes she'd been wearing since I'd moved in, with no evidence of the gradual size increases that typically began during the second trimester. In her jewelry box, tucked beneath necklaces and earrings, I found something that made my breath catch: a small plastic device that looked like a miniature recording device. I'd seen similar items advertised in magazines for people who wanted to secretly document conversations or meetings. I was still staring at the device when I heard the front door open and Tasha's voice calling out a cheerful hello. Quickly replacing everything exactly as I'd found it, I hurried back to the living room and picked up a book, trying to look like I'd been reading peacefully all afternoon. "How was your shopping trip?" I asked when Tasha appeared with several department store bags. "Productive," she said, settling the bags near the stairs. "I found some lovely things for the nursery. Micah and I are planning to start setting it up next month." "That's exciting. Will you be using the guest room?" The question was strategic. I wanted to understand the timeline of when they expected me to be gone. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Actually, we were thinking the guest room would be perfect for a nursery. It gets beautiful morning light, and it's close to our bedroom for nighttime feedings. The implication was clear. The guest room where I was currently staying would need to be vacated before nursery preparations began. "When were you thinking of starting the conversion?" I asked. "Well," Tasha said, perching on the edge of the sofa with that practiced grace I'd begun to find suspicious. "Ideally, we'd like to have everything ready by the end of my second trimester. That gives us plenty of time to get settled before the baby arrives." I did the math quickly. If she was 14 weeks along, the end of her second trimester would be in about 12 weeks, early February. That suggested they wanted me out of their house within the next 3 months. "That makes sense," I said. "I should probably start making firm plans for my own living situation." "We've been thinking about that too," Tasha said, her voice taking on the gentle tone people used when delivering difficult news. "Micah and I visited Magnolia Gardens yesterday afternoon. It's really quite lovely, much nicer than I expected." The casual way she delivered this information felt rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment to mention their reconnaissance mission. "You visited without me?" "We wanted to get a sense of the place before suggesting you see it. You know how stressful new environments can be when you're recovering from health issues." Another assumption about my limitations that didn't match my actual experience. But I was beginning to understand that Tasha's version of my recovery bore little resemblance to reality. "What did you think of it?" I asked. "Beautiful grounds, excellent medical facilities, wonderful staff. They have art classes, book clubs, even field trips to local attractions. It's like a community designed specifically for people in your situation, people in my situation." The phrase lingered in the air between us, defining me as someone whose situation required managed care rather than independent choice. That evening at dinner, Micah enthusiastically described their visit to Magnolia Gardens, painting a picture of active senior living that might appeal to someone looking for community and convenience. His description was detailed and positive, focusing on amenities and activities rather than the underlying assumption that I needed to be somewhere other than my own home. "They have a waiting list," he mentioned casually while passing the salad. "But they said if we put in an application soon, a spot might open up in the next month or two." "A spot might open up," I repeated. "You mean when someone dies?" The bluntness of my question created an uncomfortable silence. Micah shifted in his chair while Tasha studied her plate with sudden fascination. "That's not how we like to think about it," Micah said finally. "People move in and out of facilities like that for lots of reasons. But we all knew the primary reason spots opened up at places like Magnolia Gardens. We just weren't supposed to say it out loud during dinner conversation." After Micah and Tasha went to bed, I sat in the guest room with my sewing basket, working on a christening gown I'd started for the baby. The delicate white cotton required careful attention, each tiny stitch a meditation on the future I was supposedly preparing for. But as I worked, I found myself thinking about the pregnancy journal, the unopened test, the recording device, and the convenient timeline that would have me moved out just as nursery preparations began. Individually, each element could be explained away. Together, they suggested a pattern of deception that went far beyond simple family dynamics. If Tasha wasn't really pregnant, then everything else, the urgency about my living situation, the medical concerns, the need for space and quiet became part of an elaborate fiction designed to remove me from my son's life and his house. But why? What could she possibly gain from such an intricate deception? The answer came to me as I tied off a particularly delicate hemstitch, Charles's inheritance. The trust fund he'd established that was designed to provide for my care in my final years, the money that would pass to Micah upon my death. But that remained under my control as long as I was alive and competent. If I was declared incompetent and moved to managed care, control of that trust could potentially be transferred to my next of kin. If I was isolated from friends and community members who might question such arrangements, the transfer could happen without outside scrutiny. Suddenly, the fake pregnancy made perfect sense. It provided a reasonable justification for moving me out while creating a sympathetic narrative about young couple needing space for their growing family. It cast Tasha as the caring daughter-in-law who'd sacrificed her comfort to help her mother-in-law recover, now deserving of her own space and privacy. Setting down my sewing, I walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Charles had proposed all those years ago. He'd told me that day that he would always protect me, always make sure I was safe and loved and valued. He couldn't protect me now. But he'd given me something almost as valuable, the resources and the stubbornness to protect myself. If Tasha wanted to play games with my life and my legacy, she was about to discover that this old woman still had some fight left in her. The recording device I'd found in Tasha's jewelry box haunted my thoughts for 3 days before I decided to take action. If she was documenting conversations for reasons I didn't understand, then perhaps it was time for me to do some documenting of my own. The irony wasn't lost on me using the tools of deception to uncover truth, but desperate times had always called for creative solutions. On Tuesday morning, while Tasha was at what she claimed was a prenatal appointment with Dr. Patterson, I drove to the electronics store on Abercorn Street. The young man behind the counter looked surprised when I asked about small recording devices, clearly not expecting a 69-year-old woman to be interested in surveillance equipment. "Are you looking for something to record lectures or meetings?" he asked helpfully. "Something like that," I said. "I need something small and discreet that records clearly." He showed me several options, explaining battery life and storage capacity with the patience of someone who'd learned not to make assumptions about what older customers might need. I settled on a device about the size of a thumb drive that could record continuously for up to 8 hours and would fit easily in my pocket or purse. "One question," I said as he rang up my purchase. "If someone wanted to check whether another person was recording them, how would they do that?" The young man looked puzzled by the question but answered thoughtfully. "Most of these devices have a small LED light that blinks when they're recording, and they emit a very faint electronic signal that specialized detectors can pick up. But, honestly, unless someone knows what to look for, these are pretty much undetectable." Driving home, I felt like I was crossing a line I'd never imagined having to cross. Recording conversations without consent felt wrong on every level, but so did being manipulated out of my home and independence by people who claimed to love me. Sometimes protecting yourself required actions that contradicted your natural inclinations. That afternoon, I decided to test my new device during what I'd begun thinking of as one of Tasha's performance conversations, interactions that felt designed to create specific impressions rather than communicate genuine information. I was reading in the living room when she returned from her appointment, looking appropriately tired and slightly overwhelmed in the way pregnant women often did after medical visits. "How did everything go?" I asked, activating the recorder in my pocket with the button press I'd practiced earlier. "Wonderful," Tasha said. settling onto the couch with a soft sigh. Dr. Patterson says everything is progressing perfectly. The baby's measurements are right on track. Did you get any new pictures? Tasha's hand moved to her purse, then stopped. The ultrasound machine was down for maintenance today. But she listened to the heartbeat with the Doppler, still strong and steady. How exciting! What was the heart rate? 155 beats per minute, she said without hesitation. Dr. Patterson says that's perfect for this stage. I nodded appreciatively while noting that this was the exact same heart rate she'd mentioned in her pregnancy journal. In my experience, fetal heart rates varied from appointment to appointment, fluctuating within normal ranges based on the baby's activity level and position. When is your next appointment? 2 weeks from Thursday. She wants to see me every 2 weeks until I reach 20 weeks. Then we'll switch to monthly visits. That's comprehensive care, I observed. Dr. Patterson sounds very thorough. She's wonderful. Very experienced with high-risk pregnancies. This was the first mention of her pregnancy being considered high risk, and I felt my suspicions sharpen. High risk? Is there something concerning? Oh, not really high risk, Tasha said quickly. Just, first pregnancy at my age. Dr. Patterson likes to be cautious with anyone over 30. Tasha was 32, hardly an advanced maternal age that would typically warrant special monitoring. But her explanation was delivered with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having her statements accepted without question. I'm sure you're in excellent hands, I said, while privately wondering if Dr. Patterson existed at all. That evening, I listened to the recording in the privacy of the guest room, taking notes on the details Tasha had provided. Her answers had been smooth and consistent, but they lacked the spontaneous quality of genuine experience. Real pregnant women typically volunteered additional details: how long they'd waited, whether the baby had been active during the exam, funny things the doctor had said. Tasha's responses felt scripted, as if she'd prepared for exactly the questions I might ask. The next morning brought an opportunity I hadn't expected. I was having coffee in the kitchen when the phone rang, and Tasha answered with the bright cheerfulness she reserved for people outside the family. Oh, hi, Dr. Patterson's office. Yes, this is Tasha Brew. There was a pause, and I saw her face change to confusion. I'm sorry, I think there might be some mistake. I have an appointment scheduled for next Thursday. Another pause, longer this time, and Tasha's voice took on a defensive tone. Are you sure you have the right patient? Tasha Brew, BROU. Date of birth March 15th, 1993. I moved closer to the kitchen doorway, pretending to arrange flowers while straining to hear both sides of the conversation. I see, Tasha said finally. Well, there must be some confusion in your system. I'll call back later to sort this out. She hung up with more force than necessary, and I saw her staring at the phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. Problem with your appointment? I asked casually. Just a scheduling mix-up, she said, but her voice carried an edge of stress that hadn't been there moments before. Medical offices can be so disorganized. Later that morning, after Tasha left for what she described as errands, I made a decision. That would have horrified my younger self, but felt absolutely necessary given my current circumstances. I called Dr. Patterson's office. Good morning, I said to the receptionist who answered. I'm calling to confirm an appointment for my daughter-in-law, Tasha Brew. I believe she has one scheduled for next Thursday. Let me check our system. The receptionist said, and I heard the clicking of computer keys. I'm sorry, but I don't show any patient by that name in our system. Are you sure? She's been seeing Dr. Patterson for prenatal care. I'm quite sure Dr. Patterson is actually a cardiologist, not an obstetrician. You might want to check with your daughter-in-law about which practice she's been visiting. I thanked the receptionist and hung up, feeling a mixture of vindication and sick certainty. Tasha had been lying about her doctor, her appointments, and by extension, almost certainly about her pregnancy itself. But I needed more than suspicious phone calls and inconsistent details. I needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. That afternoon, I implemented a plan that felt both devious and absolutely necessary. While Tasha was out, I searched through her personal belongings more systematically than I had before. looking for evidence of the elaborate fiction she'd been constructing in her bathroom. I found the pregnancy test I'd noticed earlier, still unopened in its original packaging, but hidden behind bottles of expensive moisturizer. I found something more damning: a different pregnancy test. This one clearly used, with a positive result displayed in a little window. The test was the kind you could buy at any pharmacy, but something about it looked odd. The plastic casing seemed slightly damaged, as if it had been tampered with, and the positive result looked almost clear, too perfectly defined compared to the faint lines I remembered from my own pregnancy test decades ago. I photographed the test with my phone, then continued searching. In a drawer filled with miscellaneous items, I found what I was looking for: instructions for faking positive pregnancy tests downloaded from the internet, complete with detailed explanations about how to manipulate the chemical indicators. My hand shook as I photographed these documents, understanding finally that I was dealing with a level of deception far beyond anything I'd imagined. This wasn't a woman who was confused about her condition or exaggerating symptoms for attention. This was someone who had deliberately and methodically constructed an elaborate lie that was appending my entire life. But the most damning evidence was still to come. Hidden in a folder labeled Baby Planning, I found documents that revealed the true scope of Tasha's deception. There were printouts about Charles's trust fund, including detailed information about the conditions that would trigger transfers of control. There were copies of my medical records somehow obtained without my knowledge, with handwritten notes about cognitive decline and increasing dependency that bore no resemblance to my actual condition. Most chilling was a timeline written in Tasha's careful handwriting that laid out her strategy month by month. November, establish pregnancy. Begin documentation of Hailey's declining condition. December, increase pressure for alternative living arrangements. Get medical support for incompetency concerns. January, finalize Magnolia Gardens placement. Begin trust fund transfer procedures. February, complete nursery setup. Establish legal guardianship if necessary with clinical precision. Of it took my breath away. This wasn't impulsive manipulation. It was a calculated campaign designed to remove me from my home, my independence, and my financial security. But perhaps most heartbreaking was a note at the bottom of the timeline. Micah genuinely believes pregnancy is real. Keep it that way for his emotional investment. My son wasn't complicit in this deception. He was as much a victim as I was, manipulated by a woman who understood exactly how to exploit his desire to be a good husband and father. I photographed everything, my hand steady now that I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't family dysfunction or generational misunderstanding. This was fraud, pure and simple, designed to steal my autonomy and my late husband's legacy. As I carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, I thought about Charles and the promises we'd made to each other about protecting what we'd built together. He'd worked extra jobs and saved every penny to ensure I'd be secure in my later years. He'd established the trust fund specifically to prevent anyone from taking advantage of me if I became vulnerable or dependent. He'd never imagined that the threat would come from within our own family, from someone who'd been welcomed into our lives with love and trust. But he'd also never underestimated my ability to fight for myself when the situation demanded it. "You're tougher than you think, Hailey," he used to say when push comes to shove. "You'll do whatever needs to be done." Push had definitely come to shove. That evening, I sat through dinner listening to Tasha describe her day with the same careful performance I'd been witnessing for weeks. She mentioned feeling tired from pregnancy hormones, worrying about morning sickness returning, and looking forward to her next appointment with the fictional Dr. Patterson. Micah hung on every word, his face glowing with the excitement of an expectant father. Watching his genuine joy being manipulated so cruelly made something harden in my chest. Tasha wasn't just stealing from me, she was stealing from him too, robbing him of authentic experiences and emotions by building their foundation on lies. After dinner, while they settled in to watch television together, I excused myself to the guest room and began planning my next steps. I had evidence now, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. Confronting Tasha directly would only give her time to construct new lies or escalate her campaign against me. Involving Micah before I had overwhelming proof might backfire. If his emotional investment in the pregnancy made him resistant to seeing the truth, I needed allies, I needed professional support. And I needed to move quickly before Tasha's timeline advanced to the point where reversing the damage became impossible. Looking at Charles's ring on its chain around my neck, I made him a promise that echoed the one he'd asked of me all those years ago. I wouldn't disappear quietly. I wouldn't let anyone erase me for their convenience. And I wouldn't let his legacy be stolen by someone who saw our family as nothing more than an opportunity for financial gain. The fight was just beginning. But at least now I knew exactly what I was fighting against. The Savannah Public Library on Bull Street had always been my sanctuary, a place where I'd spent countless hours during Micah's childhood, researching everything from homework assignments to home repair techniques. Now, at 69, I found myself there again, but this time researching legal procedures and elder fraud with the determination of someone fighting for their life. The librarian, a woman about my age named Margaret who remembered me from my frequent visits over the years, helped me access legal databases and print relevant documents without asking too many questions about why I suddenly needed to understand guardianship laws and trust fund regulations. Research project, she asked diplomatically as she showed me how to use the computers. Something like that, I replied, appreciating her discretion. What I discovered during my morning of research was both illuminating and terrifying. Charles's trust fund, established shortly before his death, contained provisions that I'd never fully understood at the time. If I was declared incompetent or unable to manage my own affairs, control of the fund would transfer to my closest living relative Micah with the requirement that the money be used for my care and support. However, there was a loophole that I'd never noticed in the original documents. If Micah was deemed unable to manage the fund due to his own financial circumstances or other factors, control could be transferred to his spouse as co-trustee. The fund was substantial, nearly $400,000 that Charles had accumulated through Navy benefits, life insurance, and careful investing over the years. For someone like Tasha, accustomed to expensive tastes but married to a real estate agent still building his business, that money represented freedom from financial constraints and access to the lifestyle she felt she deserved. But accessing it required removing me from the equation, either through actual incompetency or through managed care arrangements that would gradually drain the fund through expensive facility fees and medical expenses. The fake pregnancy provided the perfect cover story. Who would question a young couple's need for space and privacy as they prepared for their first child? Who would challenge medical recommendations from concerned family members about an elderly stroke victim's declining condition? Armed with this understanding, I spent the afternoon developing a strategy that would expose Tasha's deception while protecting both Micah and myself from the emotional and legal fallout. I needed irrefutable evidence presented in a way that would make denial impossible, but I also needed to preserve my relationship with my son, who remained an innocent victim in his wife's elaborate scheme. My first call was to Dr. Roos's office, requesting an emergency appointment for the following day. When the receptionist tried to schedule for later in the week, I explained that I had urgent concerns about medication interactions and possibly fraudulent medical claims being made in my name. Dr. Ruiz will see you tomorrow at 9, the receptionist said, her tone shifting to professional concern. Please bring any documentation you have regarding these issues. My second call was to Ruby Clark's daughter, whose number I'd found in the phone book. Ruby had been my dearest friend before her children moved her to a facility against her wishes, claiming she was showing signs of dementia that her own doctor disputed. If anyone would understand what I was facing, it would be Ruby. Mama's at Magnolia Gardens, her daughter Linda said when I explained who I was. She's been asking about you, actually. Says she hasn't seen you since your stroke. I'd like to visit her, I said. Would tomorrow afternoon be possible? Of course, she'd be thrilled. She's in the independent living section, apartment 3B. Visiting hours are until 6. That evening, I prepared for what I knew would be my final dinner as a welcome guest in my son's house. Tasha was particularly animated, describing plans for converting the guest room into a nursery and sharing her excitement about upcoming baby preparations. I was thinking we could start painting next weekend, she said to Micah. Something gender neutral since we won't know if it's a boy or girl for a few more weeks. What colours are you considering? I asked. my voice level despite the anger burning in my chest, soft yellow, maybe sage green. Something calming and peaceful. Tasha's hand moved to her abdomen in that practice gesture I'd seen dozens of times. I want the baby's first environment to be serene and beautiful. That sounds lovely, I said. When exactly were you planning to start the painting? Micah and Tasha exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that excluded me from their private communication. Well, Micah said carefully, we were hoping you might be settled in your new living situation by then. It would be easier to do major projects like painting without worrying about fumes or disruption. My new living situation, I repeated. You mean Magnolia Gardens? We've been thinking it might be time to seriously consider that option, Tasha said gently. I know it feels sudden, but with the baby coming and your ongoing recovery needs, it might be the best choice for everyone. What ongoing recovery needs? I asked. Dr. Ruiz says I'm doing remarkably well. Doctors don't always see the whole picture, Tasha said, her voice taking on the patient tone people used with confused elderly patients. We live with you every day. We see the small struggles that you might not even notice yourself. The gaslighting was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that I could understand how effective it had been in undermining my confidence over the past several weeks. If I hadn't discovered the evidence of her deception, I might have begun questioning my own perceptions of my recovery. What small struggles? I pressed. Micah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Just little things. Mama, you've seemed more tired lately, a bit more unsteady on your feet, and confused sometimes, Tasha added. Yesterday, you asked me the same question 3 times about what time Micah would be home. This was a complete fabrication. I'd asked once, received an answer, and hadn't mentioned it again. But stated with such conviction and supported by Micah's concerned nod, it became part of the official narrative about my declining condition. I don't remember that, I said truthfully. That's part of what concerns us, Tasha said softly. Memory. Issues can be subtle at first. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, with Tasha constructing a careful case for my deteriorating condition while Micah provided supportive evidence that suggested he genuinely believed what his wife was telling him. I listened to them describe a version of myself that bore no resemblance to my actual experience, understanding finally how thoroughly I'd been isolated and undermined. When we finished dinner, I held clear the table while listening to their animated discussion about nursery furniture and baby-proofing strategies. Their excitement was genuine, their love for each other apparent, their anticipation about becoming parents palpable and heartbreaking, because while Tasha was lying about being pregnant, Micah's emotions were completely real. He was already in love with a child who didn't exist, already making plans for a future built on deception. When the truth came out, it wouldn't just expose Tasha's fraud, it would shatter my son's dreams and possibly his marriage. That night, lying in the guest room that Tasha was already mentally converting into a nursery, I thought about the different ways this situation could unfold. I could confront them directly with the evidence I'd gathered, but that would give Tasha time to construct new lies or claim that I was having paranoid delusions related to my stroke. I could contact the police, but fraud cases involving family members were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the victim was elderly and the perpetrator was skilled at appearing sympathetic. Or I could create a situation where Tasha's deception would be exposed naturally, in a way that would be impossible to deny or explain away. The plan that formed in my mind was risky and emotionally painful, but it offered the best chance of protecting both my independence and my relationship with Micah. It would require careful timing, reliable witnesses, and the kind of courage that comes from having nothing left to lose. I reached for Charles's ring on its chain around my neck, holding it while I thought about the conversations we'd had about justice and truth and standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. You always said I was stronger than I looked, I whispered to his memory. I guess we're about to find out just how strong. The next morning, I implemented the first phase of my plan. While Tasha was still sleeping and Micah was getting ready for work, I placed the small recording device in my purse and prepared for what I knew would be a day that changed everything. My appointment with Dr. Ruiz was scheduled for 9 o'clock. My visit with Ruby was planned for the afternoon, and somewhere between those two conversations, I intended to set in motion the events that would either restore my independence or confirm that I was truly as powerless as Tasha believed me to be as I dressed carefully in my best blue dress there. One Charles had always said brought out my eyes. I thought about the woman I'd been before the stroke, before the manipulation, before the systematic erosion of my confidence and autonomy. That woman had raised a son alone while working full-time. That woman had managed household finances and major decisions without asking anyone's permission. That woman had built a life of dignity and purpose despite losing her husband far too early. That woman was still here, underneath the layers of doubt and uncertainty that had accumulated over the past several months. Today, she was going to reclaim her life. I picked up my purse, checking to make sure the recording device was easily accessible, and headed for the door. As I passed the living room, I saw Tasha's pregnancy journal still open on the coffee table, displaying another carefully crafted entry about her fictional journey toward motherhood. By tonight, that journal would be nothing more than evidence of an elaborate crime. And Tasha would discover that underestimating the intelligence and determination of a 69-year-old woman had been the biggest mistake of her carefully planned deception. The morning sun streaming through the window seemed brighter than it had in weeks, and for the first time since seeing those admission papers on the kitchen counter, I felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, not as the diminished, dependent version of myself that others had been trying to create, but as the woman Charles had loved and believed in. The woman who had survived loss and hardship and was more than capable of surviving this betrayal too. The fight was about to begin in earnest, and I was ready. Dr. Rose's office felt different that Thursday morning, charged with the weight of truth-telling and consequence. Ailana greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she'd been thinking about our previous conversation and had drawn some concerning conclusions of her own. "Highly," she said, settling behind her desk with my file open before her. "You mentioned urgent concerns about fraudulent medical claims. What exactly is happening?" I activated the recording device in my purse and laid out everything I'd discovered. Over the past week, the fake pregnancy, the manipulated symptoms, the elaborate timeline designed to remove me from my home and access Charles's trust fund. Ailana listened without interruption, making notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated she was taking my concerns seriously. "This is quite serious," she said when I finished. "If someone is fabricating medical symptoms and attempting to have you declared incompetent for financial gain, that constitutes elder fraud. I have evidence," I said, showing her the photographs I'd taken of Tasha's documents. "But I need professional verification that there's no medical basis for the claims she's been making about my condition." Ailana reviewed my recent test results and made additional notes in my file. "Based on every evaluation I've conducted, you show no signs of cognitive decline or increased dependency. Your recovery has been remarkable for someone your age. Could you document that officially?" "I'm documenting it right now, and I'm also noting the discrepancy between your actual condition and the symptoms that have been reported to me by family members." Ailana looked up from her writing with concern. "Are you safe where you're living?" "I don't think I'm in physical danger, but I'm definitely being manipulated and coerced. I have a plan to address it, but I need you to be available if I call later today." "Of course, and highly, be careful. When people are attempting fraud on this scale, they can become desperate when they're exposed." Driving to Magnolia Gardens that afternoon, I felt the weight of impending confrontation settling over me like storm clouds gathering before a downpour. The facility was exactly as Micah had described: beautiful grounds, elegant buildings, the kind of place where families could feel good about storing their elderly relatives. Ruby was waiting for me in the lobby, thinner than I remembered, but with eyes that sparkled with the intelligence and humor that had made our friendship so precious over the years. She hugged me carefully, as if we were both made of something fragile that might break under too much pressure. "Highly brew," she said, stepping back to look at me critically. "You look tired, honey. What's happening?" "It's a long story," I said. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Ruby led me to her small apartment, a space that managed to feel like home despite its institutional origins. She'd filled it with photographs, books, and the kind of personal touches that declared this was a chosen space rather than an assigned one. "Now then," she said, settling us both with cups of tea that tasted like comfort and friendship. "Tell me what's really going on." I explained the situation from the beginning, the stroke, moving in with Micah and Tasha, the gradual pressure to move to managed care, and my growing suspicions about the pregnancy that justified everything. Ruby listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent 30 years teaching children and knew how to recognize truth from fiction. "That conniving little witch," Ruby said when I finished. "And your poor son, caught in the middle without even knowing it." "I need witnesses," I said. "People who can verify that I'm competent and capable, that the version of my condition being presented by my family doesn't match reality." "You've got me," Ruby said without hesitation. "And I know other people here who'd be happy to help. We've all seen what happens when families decide we're inconvenient." We spent the next hour planning what Ruby called Operation Truth Telling. She would contact several friends who'd known me for years, people whose testimony about my mental acuity and physical capability would be impossible to dismiss. She also suggested involving Reverend Whitman from our church, whose moral authority might help Micah see through his wife's manipulation. "When are you planning to make your move?" Ruby asked. "Tonight," I said. "I'm going to force a confrontation that makes denial impossible." Ruby studied my face with the careful assessment she'd once reserved for students who were planning something that required adult intervention. "You sure you're ready for this? Once you pull this trigger, there's no going back." "I'm sure," I said. "Charles didn't spend his life building security for our family just so it could be stolen by someone who sees us as marks rather than people." That evening, I returned to Micah's house with a plan that felt both terrifying and necessary. Tasha was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly while she chopped vegetables with the contentment of someone whose elaborate scheme was proceeding exactly as planned. "How was your day?" she asked when I appeared in the doorway. "Productive," I said, activating the recording device in my pocket. "I spent some time researching Charles's trust fund. Did you know there are provisions for transferring control if the beneficiary is declared incompetent?" Tasha's knife paused in its rhythmic chopping, and I saw her shoulders tense slightly. "I wouldn't know anything about that. Financial matters are more Micah's area, really." "Because I found some interesting documents that suggest you've been researching those provisions quite thoroughly." She turned to face me, her expression shifting from casual friendliness to guarded concern. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating directly that you've been systematically planning to have me declared incompetent so you can access my late husband's money." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Tasha set down her knife carefully and faced me fully, her mask of concerned daughter-in-law finally slipping. "You're having paranoid delusions," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone medical professionals used with confused patients. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that concerns us about your mental state. Is it paranoid to notice that you've been lying about being pregnant?" Tasha's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "How dare you question my pregnancy? What kind of sick person accuses someone of faking something like that?" "The kind of person who called Dr. Patterson's office and discovered that he's a cardiologist, not an obstetrician, and that you've never been a patient there." Now Tasha's composure cracked visibly. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, then dropped as she realized the gesture would only reinforce my accusations. "You've been snooping," she said, anger replacing the manufactured concern in her voice. "Going through my private belongings, violating my privacy." "I've been protecting myself from fraud," I corrected. "And documenting evidence of your elaborate deception." "What evidence? You're an elderly woman with cognitive issues imagining conspiracies that don't exist. The fake pregnancy test you doctored to show positive results. The timeline you wrote outlining your strategy to remove me from this house. The research you did on Charles's trust fund and the conditions for transferring control." Each revelation hit Tasha like a physical blow, her face cycling through emotions from shock to fury to calculation. I could see her mind working frantically, searching for explanations or escape routes. "Even if any of that were true," she said finally, "who would believe you? You're a stroke victim with documented cognitive decline. I'm a pregnant young woman concerned about her mother-in-law's welfare. Documented by whom? You've been the only one reporting symptoms that don't exist." scheduling appointments with doctors who don't treat pregnant women, and creating a narrative about my condition that contradicts every medical professional who's actually examined me. Tasha's laugh was sharp and bitter. Good luck proving any of that. It's your word against mine, and I'm a lot more credible than a confused old woman who's clearly having mental health issues. You're right, I said calmly. It would be my word against yours. Except I've been recording this entire conversation. The color drained from Tasha's face as she stared at me in disbelief. You're bluffing. I pulled the small recording device from my pocket and set it on the kitchen counter between us. The tiny red light blinked steadily, documenting every word of her admission. You just confessed to fabricating a pregnancy, researching financial fraud, and deliberately trying to have me declared incompetent for money, I said. In your own voice, with no ambiguity about your intentions, Tasha lunged for the recorder, but I was quicker than she expected, snatching it back and holding it protectively against my chest. It's too late, I said. This conversation is already saved. And copies will be made tonight. We heard the front door open and Micah's voice calling out his usual evening greeting. Tasha and I stood frozen in the kitchen, the recorder still, clutched in my hands, both of us understanding that the next few minutes would determine the future of this family. In here, I called back. My voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Micah appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face lighting up with the happiness of a man coming home to his pregnant wife and recovering mother. The innocence of his expression broke my heart, knowing I was about to shatter the illusion that had been sustaining him for weeks. What's going on? He asked, sensing the tension in the room. You both look upset. I looked at my son, my dear, trusting, manipulated son, and felt the weight of truth telling settle over me like a mantle of responsibility. Sit down, Micah, I said gently. There's something you need to hear. The aftermath of truth telling is never as clean as the moment of revelation itself. After Micah listened to the recording, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, anger, and heartbreak in a matter of minutes, Tasha tried one final desperate performance, claiming I had manipulated the conversation and fabricated evidence to frame her for crimes she'd never committed. But the recording was too clear, too damning, too complete in its documentation of her deception. When Micah demanded to see the fake pregnancy test and the timeline I'd photographed, when he called Dr. Patterson's office himself and confirmed that his wife had never been a patient there, when he held the falsified positive pregnancy test in his trembling hands and understood the scope of her betrayal, something fundamental shifted in the foundation of their marriage. How long? He asked her, his voice hollow with grief. How long have you been lying to me? Tasha's final attempt at manipulation was to cast herself as the victim. She'd been desperate to give him the child he wanted. She'd been scared about our financial future. She'd made mistakes, but never intended to hurt anyone. But each explanation only revealed the calculated nature of her deception, the way she'd used his love against him to facilitate her fraud. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of difficult conversations and necessary actions. I called Dr. Ruiz, who came to the house to formally document my competency and witness Tasha's recorded confession. I contacted Reverend Whitman, who arrived with the moral authority to help Micah understand that protecting me wasn't just about family loyalty, it was about preventing a crime. Ruby appeared at my door the following morning with reinforcements, 3 friends from our church who'd known me for decades and were prepared to testify to my mental acuity and physical capability. Their presence filled the house with the kind of support I'd been missing during the months of systematic isolation. That girl tried to erase you, Ruby said bluntly while we sat in my living room because I'd moved back to my own house that very day, reclaiming the space where Charles and I had built our life together. She figured an old woman would be easy to manipulate and disappear. She underestimated how stubborn I can be, I replied, feeling stronger than I had in months. The legal ramifications took weeks to sort out. Tasha had committed elder fraud, attempted financial theft, and fabricated medical conditions to facilitate both crimes. But more than that, she'd stolen months of my independence and nearly succeeded in convincing my own son that I was incompetent and burdensome. The district attorney's office took my case seriously, particularly after reviewing the recorded confession and the timeline documenting Tasha's systematic approach to fraud. Elder abuse cases were becoming increasingly common, they explained, and prosecuting them sent an important message about protecting vulnerable populations. But the most difficult part wasn't the legal proceedings, it was watching my son navigate the wreckage of his marriage and his dreams of parenthood. Micah filed for divorce within 2 weeks, but the emotional damage took much longer to heal. I should have known, he said during one of our long conversations in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I discovered those admission papers that had started this entire ordeal. I should have seen what she was doing to you. She was manipulating you too, I reminded him. You believed you were going to be a father. You thought you were protecting your pregnant wife and caring for your sick mother. Those aren't character flaws, honey. Those are the instincts of a good man. Rebuilding our relationship required patience and forgiveness on both sides. Micah had to forgive himself for being deceived, and I had to forgive him for the moments when he'd chosen Tasha's version of reality over my own experience. We had to rediscover how to be family to each other without the toxic influence of someone who'd seen us as opportunities rather than people. The house felt different after I moved back, charged with the energy of reclaimed space and restored autonomy. I threw myself back into my sewing with renewed passion, taking on projects for the historic district ladies who'd missed my careful work during my months of absence. But the most meaningful project was when I started for myself a christening gown made from the finest white cotton I could find, sewn with French seams and hand-embroidered details that would withstand generations of wear. It wasn't for any specific baby, but rather as an act of faith that someday, when Micah was ready to trust love again, there might be real grandchildren who would need such things. 6 months after the confrontation in the kitchen, I was working on the delicates marking around the gown's neckline when Micah stopped by for a weekly dinner together. These meals had become precious rituals, opportunities for us to maintain the connection that Tasha's deception had nearly severed permanently. What are you working on? He asked, examining the intricate needlework with the appreciation he'd inherited from watching me sew throughout his childhood. A christening gown, I said. For future grandchildren, when the time is right. Micah was quiet for a long moment, fingering the delicate fabric with the careful touch of someone who understood its value. Do you think I'll ever be able to trust someone enough to have children? I think, I said carefully, that you'll learn to distinguish between people who love you and people who use love as a tool to get what they want. It takes time, but you'll get there. How can you be so sure? Because you're Charles' Bruce's son. And Charles never let one bad experience stop him from believing in good ones. The legal case against Tasha concluded 8 months later with a plea agreement that included restitution, community service, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting either Micah or me. She'd moved back to Charlestown, where her family's reputation provided some insulation from the scandal but couldn't entirely protect her from the consequences of her actions. More importantly, the case had attracted attention from local elder advocacy groups who used my experience to educate other seniors about the warning signs of family financial abuse. I found myself speaking at community centers and church groups, sharing my story as a way to help other older adults recognize and resist manipulation. The hardest part, I would tell these audiences, isn't recognizing that someone is lying to you. It's recognizing when someone is lying to themselves about you when they've convinced themselves that taking away your independence is really about caring for your welfare. These speaking engagements became a source of unexpected fulfillment, a way to transform my painful experience into something that might protect other people from similar betrayal. Ruby often accompanied me to these events, serving as living proof that older women could be allies for each other in ways that transcended family relationships. 1 year after the confrontation that changed everything, I was featured in the Savannah Morning News in an article about elder fraud prevention. The reporter was a young woman about Tasha's age who interviewed me in my living room, surrounded by the quilts and photographs and accumulated treasures of a life fully lived. What advice would you give to other seniors who suspect they're being manipulated by family members? She asked. Trust your instincts, I said without hesitation. When something feels wrong, it usually is wrong, even if you can immediately explain why. And remember that real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller or less capable to accommodate other people's needs. The article generated responses from readers across Georgia, many of them sharing their own stories of family manipulation and financial abuse. Some had successfully fought back, while others were still trapped in situations they didn't know how to escape. I began corresponding with several of these people, offering advice and encouragement based on my own experience. Dr. Ruiz retired that spring, but not before creating a comprehensive medical record that documented my complete recovery and cognitive competency. "You've become one of my favorite success stories," she told me during her farewell appointment. "Not just because of your physical recovery, but because of how you fought for yourself when it mattered most. Charles's trust fund remains securely under my control, managed now with the oversight of a financial advisor who specialized in elder care planning. The money would continue to provide for my independence as Charles had intended, and whatever remained would eventually pass to Micah with the confidence that he'd use it wisely." Micah had grown stronger over the year, more discerning in his relationships, and more protective of his boundaries. He'd started dating again recently, a fellow real estate agent named Sarah who treated me with genuine warmth rather than calculated charm. She was quiet and thoughtful, with laugh lines around her eyes, and the kind of steady presence that suggested she'd weathered her own storms and emerged with intact integrity. "She's not in any hurry," Micah told me one evening as we worked together in my garden, planting azaleas to replace the ones damaged during a winter storm. "She says good things are worth waiting for." "Smart woman," I replied, thinking about Charles and the way he'd courted me patiently, building trust through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. On the anniversary of my confrontation with Tasha, I hosted a dinner party for the people who'd supported me through the crisis. Ruby, Reverend Whitman, Dr. Ruiz, and several neighbours who'd provided emotional support during the darkest weeks. Micah and Sarah joined us, along with two women I'd met through my advocacy work who'd become cherished friends. The table was set with my good china and the crystal glasses Charles and I had received for our wedding, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I might provide for them. The conversation flowed easily, moving from current events to shared memories to plans for the future with the comfortable rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. After dinner, as we sat in the living room with coffee and the pound cake that had been Charles's favourite dessert, Ruby raised her cup in an impromptu toast. "To Hailey," she said, who reminded all of us that getting older doesn't mean getting weaker. "To friendship," I replied, "and to the courage to demand the respect we deserve." Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, I sat in my sewing room working on the christening gown that had become my meditation on hope and possibility. The basement room where Charles had once worked with his hands to build and repair things was now filled with my own creative tools, evidence of the different ways people could make beauty and meaning in the world. I thought about the woman I'd been before the stroke, confident in her independence, but perhaps too trusting of family dynamics. I thought about the woman I'd become during the months of manipulation, uncertain, doubting her own perceptions, gradually accepting limitations that weren't real. And I thought about the woman I was now, stronger for having been tested, wiser for having been betrayed, more grateful for authentic relationships because I'd experienced counterfeit ones. The recording device I'd used to capture Tasha's confession was stored now in my jewelry box, next to Charles's ring and the other treasures I'd accumulated over nearly 70 years of living. I kept it not as evidence of past crimes, but as a reminder of my own capability for decisive action when circumstances demanded it. Outside my window, Savannah slept peacefully under a canopy of stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human dramas. Some stories ended in betrayal and loss, while others concluded with justice and renewed strength. Mine had been fortunate enough to include both the testing and the triumph, the betrayal and the restoration. I finished the final stitches on the christening gown's hem and held it up to the light, examining the delicate handiwork that represented Hours of patient labor and unshakable faith in the future. Someday, God willing, this gown would clothe a real baby Micah's child, perhaps, or the child of some other family member I hadn't yet met. But even if that day never came, the act of creating something beautiful for an uncertain future was its own form of victory. Setting the completed gown carefully in its preservation box, I turned off the sewing room lights and climbed the stairs to my bedroom, grateful for the steady strength in my legs and the clarity in my mind. I was tired in the way that comes from a full day's work, rather than from confusion or illness, tired in a way that promised restful sleep and productive tomorrow's dawd. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, 69-year-old woman who'd survived loss, illness, betrayal, and financial manipulation to emerge with her dignity and independence intact. My hair was silver now, my face marked by the experiences I'd weathered, but my eyes were still sharp with intelligence and determination. "Too smart to be small," I whispered, remembering Charles's words from so many years ago. "Too smart to be small." And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that no one would ever make me small again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.